So my name's Graham Smith. I'm the Open Data Program Manager at Springer Nature. And today I'm going to be talking about our interventions, our policy, and some of our training approaches around data sharing. And this is really one of the areas within open science that we've chosen to show you what some of the learnings that we've had are on the ground, some of the real insights that we can give you into publishers' role within this and to how to effectively make a change within open science. So I am also joined by Dr. Erica Pastrana, who's an editorial director within the Nature portfolio and has done a lot of work within defining our overall open science strategy and approach. Dr. Patrick Goymer, who's chief editor of Nature Ecology and Evolution, which has really led the way in a lot of the data sharing initiatives, which I will talk about later. And Kaya Motta, who's the head of academic affairs for North America. And Kaya will largely be looking after the questions in the chat as you send it through. Okay, so quick couple of general housekeeping bits. The Q&A is accessible for you to answer questions throughout. The session today, I'm going to run through our overall open science vision and then through in a bit more depth some of the initiatives that we've launched in terms of policy, in terms of editorial expertise and technology. We'll then have a bit of a panel discussion, the others from Springer Nature that I've mentioned, and then we will come on to your questions and answers, and there'll be a chance to answer them or ask them live. But we'll also talk about those that you've asked within the Q&A. Feel free to keep using the chat at the same time. And as I said, Kaya will keep an eye on that. If you could keep yourself muted until that point, though, and then we'll address any of your questions in that final section. So the first question I really wanted to put in everyone's heads before we get into the detail of this is really how do we move the needle around open science? So there's been great interest in this. There's been lots of positive direction that we've seen. We've seen these top-down policies, and we've seen things like the more bottom-up behavioral principles and initiatives. We've seen the UNESCO Open Science Recommendation, the Nelson Memo, the NIH mandate around data sharing. But what really works on the ground level? Because we're talking about behavior change here, essentially how we move towards a model where research outputs are shared openly. And this is really a key theme that I want to explore throughout when I'm talking about what we have tried at Springer Nature. So I want to start off talking about this particular case study of the Human Genome Project. And when this started out, it was really a moonshot type idea. In the early 90s, it wasn't initially that clear that it could be done at all. And by the time it was complete in 2000, the data were published openly on the internet before the related publication. Now, this is particularly relevant for genomics, but also relevant for the wider issue of data sharing. At that point, it cost $1 billion to sequence the human genome, and today the cost is $3,000 to $5,000. So we've seen that this has had a huge impact. Like, huge number of diseases have been identified as a result. Sorry, I think somebody's got their mic on. Could they mute that? Thank you. And we've seen a huge number of drugs developed, for example, areas like advanced melanoma, and this has already enabled technologies in much broader fields than human health. So it's had huge innovations within genomics, but like I said, also had huge innovations within the field of data sharing. The Bermuda Principles, for example, that were established around the time of the Human Genome Project, that sequence data should be shared openly and prior to publication. Now what we've seen is that areas such as genomics have really set the model for data sharing, both within community adoption, but also setting this model for other disciplines. So this community growth model is also particularly relevant to the role that publishers can play within data sharing, in that publishers haven't set their own rules around this. We've attempted to really enforce and reflect community expectations here. And this is really a key role that we play. Journal policies were developed off the back of this that really enforce the original ideas set out by the Bermuda Principles of sharing that data openly. It's also worth noting that there's a lot of conversation around the costs and the funding of research data management, and the upfront costs that has. But the ultimate benefits of this can also, they do also reflect these huge value added into not only the economy, but also reproducibility of science. So why, as publishers, are we interested in data sharing? Well, the data are fundamentally the evidence behind the claims that we publish in the literature. They're also the building blocks of further research. And we put a lot of effort into making articles, the version of record, ensuring their integrity, making sure that they're reviewed. They're built into the things like credit mechanisms, which really impact how research is performed. But where we're heading is to broaden this from just the article to actually ensure that those integrity measures, those credit mechanisms reflect, for example, data, code, protocols. So more like a package of open outputs. And the key idea here is that embedding of trust and integrity within that process the publishers can play. It's important to note that there are challenges within this. If we consider this figure, so this is $28 billion a year. It's a figure that a study in 2015, so this may even be higher by now, came up with on the cost of irreproducible biology research just to the US alone. And we've seen other studies coming up with comparable figures that run into billions around the lack of available, accessible, interoperable research data and what cost that really has to society, as well as on having to duplicate research and just the impact on reproducibility more widely. You've seen these failure rates by pharmaceutical industry trying to replicate peer-reviewed papers. So again, what we're really talking about is this behavior change issue to tackle these. So again, how do we move the needle to really move from that successful embedding within a community that we saw, for example, within genomics, to address these wider issues? Well, in response to these challenges, we've seen policy moves, for example, introducing mandates. So the Nelson memo, a lot of it was focused around open access to articles, but it's really important and really crucial to see that data was a key part of this too. Underlying data must be shared. Likewise, the NIH having this mandate to share data, which has recently gone into place. But this is really putting requirements back onto researchers. And there are some vagaries as well, as I think was covered in the opening plenary. What level of sharing, how it will be funded, for example. And on the other side to this, there is some evidence around the benefits of sharing data. For example, improvements in citation rates for publications and more publications actually coming out of studies themselves. So again, if we look at this from a behavioral perspective, we can look at these things as almost like the carrots and the sticks, but they all sit along this idea of motivation. So how can we put more motivations onto authors? And is this necessarily a useful way to look at things? You know, all of this hinges on researchers being highly motivated by either the carrots or the sticks to be able to actually change their behavior. And also bear in mind that, so this FDP report from 2018 determined that PIs, so researchers, might be spending up to half their time really just managing policy compliance as opposed to performing research. So we're thinking about motivations in this case, but another way to look at this is we actually need to make these practices around open science more accessible. This fog behavior model really shows that if you're going to change something, if you're going to employ some kind of trigger to try and shift behavior in a certain direction, you can either try to change the motivations, so increase the level of requirements policy, increase the attractiveness of it through benefits, or you can make it easier to do. Those are two ways of actually getting to that point of success. And this is also borne out in things like the Centre for Open Science's culture change model, which is another way of looking at it. So behaviour change on the individual basis, culture change really within a research community. And again, it involves these key elements of policy, making it easy, making it possible. Now, as I'll cover within the examples, I'm going to go into a bit more detail about the key formula we found in terms of our open science policy as a publisher involve these elements of policy, editorial expertise, and technology. So these three kind of key elements in terms of making a difference on the ground for something that works in open science. Okay. So looking at policy first, Springer Nature was one of the first large-scale publishers to have a data policy framework. And we're actually one of the first to be able to move beyond that to having really a single level of policy across our research journals. So a year ago, we announced this move to a single policy, and we've been rolling it out ever since. And really, this is founded around the idea of transparency for underlying data. It's not a mandate like the NIH's that all data must be shared in a particular way, but it is a mandate for transparency through data availability statements. This is something that Nature journals and BMC journals have had since 2016. And it's important to recognize that this both gives us the ability to measure open science. So it gives publishers, funders, and institutions a way to actually find out how data are being shared, as well as encouraging data sharing itself. So what we're seeking to do is really reinforce the trust in publications, but also make all of this more accessible, make it more achievable. So for authors, it's much clearer in terms of the guidance they see. So we really overhauled all of our policy information and put it into one central place and provided some examples in each different discipline. From the perspective of editors and editorial support teams, we're able to really smooth the compliance with the policy by making it much more straightforward. Really just having a single policy level so we know what checks have to be put in place. Where we are right now, so we've moved beyond this kind of four-tiered system that I mentioned, and gone as this single, or we are moving towards a single policy level. So we're actually at a stage of having added nearly 1,700 titles onto this policy level, which represents great strides in that respect, but it's still around 50% of our overall titles. It still represents much more than 50% of our original research titles, which is where this is really focused on. So again, this original policy framework we had in 2016 was quite groundbreaking, but we're really focused on this idea of making it more accessible and making it more straightforward, but also rolling it out in a way that's applicable across all disciplines. How we're doing that, like I mentioned, we've overhauled the guidance which is available for authors. We've already rolled out support for both editors and researchers who have to engage with this policy. So we can see, for example, what a good data availability statement looks like. And we've really tried to move away from having really templated statements that authors may just copy and put them verbatim into their articles, into what illustrative examples might look like in a particular research area. So to summarize that policy part, we're rolling this out across 3,000 journals. So this is a huge move. And it's something which really takes quite a lot of work in the background. And in order to be able to do that, we have had to make things more straightforward. And we've had to really smooth these compliance checks that are performed by a very large number of editorial support teams and editors themselves. Likewise, in standardizing our guidance, we're looking to make it easier for authors. Crucially, this also provides us a platform to investigate things like automation. So if we're looking at automation, the important thing is that we have to keep the human in the loop. We're not looking at just turning this over to a machine to do. What we are looking to do is really supplement some of the human checks with things that can be automatically pulled out. Crucial point here is, though, we don't expect the policy to solve all the challenges around open science. And as I'll come to in the next sort of sections, this really sets a baseline expectation on which we can build. And that leads quite nicely into the second kind of ingredient for our open science, which is our editorial expertise. So if we consider that the data availability statements that we're adding in, the policy to have a statement, doesn't necessarily dictate a particular data sharing type. It's not a policy that requires all data to be shared in a repository. And part of the reason for that is we know that different research communities are at different levels of maturity around repository use. Some may not be ready, and we don't want to really have to exclude particular research communities from our policies for this reason. A study in 2022 found that particularly problematic method of data sharing, data being made available on request, only around 7% of authors were actually making that data available. So this is really not an ideal situation. And this is something that we really need to approach again from a behavioral perspective. And what we want to do is get authors towards sharing in a better way, for example, sharing their data in a recognized repository. Now, if we look at the example of the Nature journals, as I mentioned, they've had this requirement around data availability statements going back to 2016. However, the problem of available on request was identified relatively soon. And it was really identified as something as essentially an opt-out. So it's not that we think authors are necessarily being dishonest when they add this into their articles, but it sort of kicks the can down the road a bit. It just says, okay, I'm going to get to the point of publishing my paper and not think about the data sharing at this stage. It's then a lot harder for a researcher to share their data when they're asked for it, say, 3 years later on. They're going to have to find the exact data. Has it been archived in the right way? Has it been shared in the right way? Compared to depositing it in a repository at the point or earlier than publication. So without explicitly changing the policy or banning the statement, Nature, Ecology and Evolution had began to challenge authors on this, to employ these nudges really to say, okay, why are you sharing your data available on request? And is there a good reason for this? And immediately some of the results were evident that this changed authors' behavior. So it didn't need a mandate necessarily. It didn't need a ban. It just needed some of these nudges in this direction. Say, okay, if you just challenge authors on this, they will actually, more of them will take up an option like sharing their data openly in a repository. And this was rolled out across the other Nature journals in 2018. And what we can see that this looks like, so in this graph, the blue section is really data being shared in an article openly. The red is data only being shared, available on request, and the yellow is a combination of the two. So we can really see from that point of 2018 that data available on request really dropped down to a very small minority, having made up over a quarter of all papers prior to that. It's really a minority of papers. And while it is still present, it tends to be present if there's a good justification alongside an open data sharing method. And we can see that 75% of those papers now sharing their data, making their data publicly available. And this is something which is based on 4 Nature journals that were actually part of a Figshare pilot that I'll talk about in a minute. We pulled out similar kind of data really to try and relate this to the NIH mandate. We only have the data from 2019 in this case, but we can see a similar pattern emerging where data available on request has really dropped the Nature portfolio down to these relatively low methods, even though there is a bit of an uptick of this mixed mode in the last year. And for the journal which really started it all, which is Patrick's journal, Nature, Ecology and Evolution, you can really see these very low rates of use of data available on request, going all the way back to when the policy started. So again, this is really illustrative in terms of the fact that we didn't have to make a wholesale change to our policy, but there were certain ways that we could really nudge authors towards better practice. Now, another key factor in this is it's not just a case of pushing back on behavior what we don't want to see. We also need to make the preferred options more accessible and really nudge authors in the direction of doing that. Otherwise, there's some evidence to say they may just take the next easiest option, which may not also be that helpful. And in this case, it's that we want to see data sharing within repositories. And we can see at Nature, Ecology and Evolution, looking over that same time period, it roughly matches, we're up to 75% of articles actually using repositories. So that 75% we were seeing of data sharing openly, it's successfully converted that into data being shared the way that we want to see it. Some of this will relate to both the Figshare integration that I mentioned, but also an ongoing relationship with the repository Dryad and then within the ecology and evolution space. And once we get into the discussion, we can talk a bit to Patrick about the experiences of editors in actually making this behavioral shift. Likewise, there's been some shifts in our approach to data curation at Springer Nature. So from 2018 to 2021, we had a very bespoke, very highly specialized service called Research Data Support. The idea of this was that it was meant to be language editing for data. So to sit entirely separate to the editorial process, and we would do things like provide checks on data, provide metadata creation and deposition to a repository. Broadly speaking, even though we offered this in pairing with funders and institutions, what we found was that the uptake really wasn't that high. And what we really found was that the incentives weren't that strong in that case, even in cases where there were some sort of policy directions to do this. So what we saw was really on that motivation axis that I mentioned, the motivations just weren't that high to really power this service to be the thing that really moved the needle in terms of open science. Anything that really involved additional work around submission, we found was quite off-putting to authors. And so rather than focusing on the level of specialism in this, we really had to start thinking more about how we could make this smoother and more integrated for authors. And really a key learning we had was that we only really saw this successful uptake when we really partnered very strongly with the journal and the editor, the people who are actually doing the work at the coalface of open science. So one of the things that we elected to do from this, again, to really learn from offering this service, was to shift from providing curation in a relatively small number of settings to providing curation support as trainers of editorial support teams, which meant that we could provide support across the portfolio more widely, improve the basic level of data handling, and identify what some of the key bottlenecks were so that we could actually speed up data compliance and tailor the training to what we knew the problems to be. Another great example, I think, of where editorial expertise needs to be layered onto policy is this growing area of focus where editors are the bridge between policy and new developments. So, for example, the CARE principles around data sovereignty and about equitable access. There's lots of questions in this about open versus more restricted access, whether more restricted access may guarantee a greater level of equity. And what we see is that this isn't always strongly reflected in policy yet, but it's the editors who are actually having to make the decisions on this to really get this balance right. And editors within their particular areas are making these decisions which really set standards. And we can see the publication of these CARE principles and the commentary within Nature, Ecology and Evolution is really helping to define that conversation and shift us towards a more equitable stance, really to move that conversation along. So yeah, I think I've covered this already, but the summary slide is essentially that editorial expertise is really the key ingredient to facilitate this. It's not a case of just making a top-down policy and then leaving authors to it. It's really essential to partner with those who are working with these manuscripts and working with researchers. And it's a two-way process. So the issues which are being brought to our specialist data team by editors, we will tend to incorporate those and use them as examples of particular problems to be working on. Also, the fact that we can work incrementally without having to change the policy every time. So if we start pushing back on a particular statement type, if we start employing a particular check in a certain place, these incremental improvements based on our learnings are really valuable. Okay, and the final element that I want to talk about is this idea of technology. So we've integrated the Figshare data repository with the Nature portfolio journals. This is a generalist data repository, so it's very widely applicable. Again, there's this real focus on making it simple to use, with the idea that if we do this, authors will naturally take it up without really having to change the motivations that much, without having to introduce a new policy around it. Again, if there's a community standard or a community expectation, we want to continue to reflect this. We're not seeking to use Figshare to supersede other repositories in the area. We just want to provide a generally applicable solution. And again, this is really focused on this idea of ease of use. So authors can submit their data when they're submitting their manuscript. The advantage that we have, again, building on this idea of specialism and expertise, is that we can apply checks while this is being stored privately, make it available to reviewers, and then provide a greater level of support to authors than just, for example, pointing them to a separate repository. Then the outputs can be published alongside each other when the article is published. So we piloted this on 7 journals initially. And what we saw in the first 10-week pilot was we're seeing 13% of submitted manuscripts using this. This is on top of all of the authors who are already using repositories. Now, this is a great example. We didn't have to change the policy. We didn't really have to change anything else around the motivations of researchers. We just had to make an existing solution easier. And this, in turn, translated through to the published article, where we saw repository use really across the Nature portfolio. I've added a bit of a gap in here because there was a gap between when we added the integration. It's not a full year's data, but we could see 62% of articles using repositories when the integration was in place, compared to 42% in the pre-implementation period, which is actually 50% in the last year of that. So again, it correlates with this. It's not the same as doing a controlled trial on this, but we can really see that correlation between just adding an easier solution and getting more data into repositories. So again, really, without having to rely on these carrots and sticks, these motivations, either to tempt authors to do it or to force them to do it, really, if we just make things easier and then continue to iteratively improve this, we don't have to keep changing our policies, for example, but we can build on what we've learned. And so really, just to wrap up, it's worth noting that when I said our open science vision includes all these different outputs, that is still true. We've talked about data sharing a lot here, but we've seen a lot of moves to employ the same kind of learnings, the same kind of policies, and the same kind of systems to both code and protocols. And Erica has really been instrumental in our code policy and working with CodeOcean in a similar way to Figshare. And I think CodeOcean's seen even greater uptake figures. So again, our learnings are really things that we can apply in other areas here to really help with that behavior change, to shift researchers towards open science as standard. I'd also just like to finish on this final encouraging point. So I talked about a lot of the challenges here, and I've talked about like the difficulties of behavior change, but it is worth noting that research data sharing is becoming more of a norm. And this is an example of all of the Springer Nature articles, which are linking to just the 3 main generalist repositories, Figshares and Odor-Dryad, or sorry, 3 of the main generalist repositories. And we can see in 2023, this really increased to around 16,000 articles sharing the data in these repositories. That's not even counting all the other specialist repositories out there. So there's a great platform to build on, and we're aware of the challenges within this. But I think that one of the initial challenges is actually getting that engagement with open science in the first place. Okay. So now what I would like to move on to is bringing in our panelists, so Erica and Patrick. I can see there's been some questions coming through as well, but if you don't mind, I will kick off with just a couple of our general conversation points, then maybe we can start to look at some of those Q&As that should come in. Okay, so the first point I really wanted to pick up was, so I talked about this pushing back on data available on request. And Patrick, it was your journal, Nature Ecology and Evolution, which really kicked this off within the Nature portfolio. Did you find that the authors tended to follow better data sharing methods as a result, or that they tended to take the next easiest option, for example? Was it a case of just making this sort of challenge and that fixed everything, or was there an iterative sort of process of improving this?
That's a good question, Grant. There was probably a couple of steps along the way. The biggest step was just pushing back, and that got, most authors doing better data sharing, and that was probably explains the biggest proportion of the change. But then we'd notice other slight differences. So for authors that had some data that were required by policy to be in a particular structured data set, like genomic data, we would suddenly notice that they're ignoring any other data they've got in there, and so they had conformed to the policy by uploading their genomic data, and the other data had somehow got lost. Whereas authors who didn't have any genomic data were uploading into a, say, Dryad or Figshare or something. So we had to make tweaks like that to make sure that sections of the data weren't getting missed. So it's iterative in that sense, but we were pushing against a fairly open door. And I think, as your data showed, our use of repositories and the lack of data on request was at a different level to some of the other nature journals in the first place. So that's why we could do it. And particularly Dryad is something that our community is very used to. But we did find also that people were very keen to just throw it into the supplementary information as a first step, which, I mean, is much better than available on request, but it's still not in any way approaching a fair kind of data sharing. So that was, so it took us a year or two to iron out these little misunderstandings, I guess.
Sure. But what would you say is the impact of that really been on your team? Do you feel like your team was already expert enough in the field of data sharing to be able to do this immediately, or did it have to involve some level of either upskilling or kind of community engagement, like you mentioned, working with Dryad, for example?
It wasn't a huge amount, and that was the essential thing here. That we, editors have very limited time, and this was something that was not going to occupy a huge amount of our time. We did have to occasionally come and ask questions to, say, your team, to when there were specific data concerns we didn't have the expertise for. But in the vast majority of cases, it was something that we could handle relatively easily. That's for the data availability on request in the statements. The Figshare integration, there was more learning required. I think that was something that it was key that your team had it set up, and our editors had to really work out how it worked in a far more sophisticated way than the data availability statements.
Yeah, that's interesting. That was one of the next questions I was going to have, actually, which was what do you feel is more impactful, actually, just the challenge to making data available on request, or the provision of a better option like a repository option? Like the actual providing something just more integrated and smoother, but may take a little bit more work and maybe a little bit trickier to validate.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the data availability was the big easy win, but in terms of the quality of the papers we publish, I think that the Figshare thing is hugely important, because that's data that's made available to the reviewers at an earlier stage. So we're not just conforming to standards and allowing these papers to be used afterwards. We're improving the quality of the published manuscript because it was reviewed better. So I think that's possibly more important.
Sure. Erica, I might just bring you in on this point, because so you're the editorial director for, I'd say, a relatively diverse set of journals within applied sciences. And how do you get the balance right, really, I would say, in standardizing sort of policy and technical solutions across a range of journals? And what does this actually look like within your portfolio?
Yeah, thanks, Graham. So I think some of the challenges you've covered, right, that we need to definitely be mindful of the community stage and how researchers are inherently approaching sharing of data before we perhaps provide sort of our own guidance and our own solution. So our editors, I mean, the value of our brand really is having editors that really spend time in that community. They go to meetings, they talk to researchers, and they inform when a community has certain needs or certain approaches to these policies. So, Patrick knows a lot about what the community in ecology and evolution was ready to sort of embrace back in the day. And they were a very early adopter community, much like genetics. Now we have other communities that we know are going to take a bit longer. And there are communities in the journals that I manage that have special requirements, like we publish more and more clinical science and clinical papers, and we are very aware of the difficulties of adapting a one-size-fits-all for those communities that have special needs. So the first thing is that sort of connection with the community, and having the editors on the ground is really our approach to that. And they inform how we implement those policies. The advantages, as Patrick said, are, that eventually what you obtain with that is that one journal also stimulates another, and through that, one community may move the needle through the actions of the journals a little bit faster than if we had just been perhaps waiting. So in the case that we've seen with ecology and evolution, I think seeing that editorial practice be implemented in a journal where that community was ready really inspired a lot of the other journals to think about following suit and encouraging that in their community and establishing that conversation. So there's a little bit of a network effect also that we have across our journals. I have a lot of computational journals too in my portfolio. They also have their own needs. For example, when you pair the data and the code, you might have advantages of following a certain policy or editorial practices that's specifically a better fit for that community. So we do try to tailor our approaches to the communities that we serve as much as possible through that, handcrafted editorial engagement with the community.
That's actually a really good point. I think one of your previous comments sort of led quite nicely into the question I was going to ask next, which is really that this idea of embedding something very widely across the journal's portfolio, but also making it relevant to a particular journal. So some might say, okay, this is all very well for nature journals where you can potentially employ these slightly stricter requirements without fear of necessarily losing submissions. But it's a really useful guide, I would say, this policy move that the Nature Journal has introduced data availability statements. And now we can see we're in a position to be able to do this across the portfolio. Is this something that you would see as the same for data sharing, or do we have to have a completely different approach elsewhere? To what extent of this is it a different case for the journals that you're managing?
Well, I think the formula that you presented is really gives us the richness, right, of the approach, because and these three initiatives, policies, editorial involvement, let's say, and technology support, they all work together and they're complementary. So, my big advice to the audience is, any of these things moves the needle in some respects. And all these efforts are really worthwhile. So what we can do with that is adapt a little bit where the emphasis may be in different journals, in different communities, like we were saying, that have specific needs. So with data, for example, as you know very well, and you covered, with the nature journals, we had established very early that requirement for data availability. So we had done that, and there was a real need to do more on top of that and see how we could influence behavior. Where that's where editorial involvement and technology have come to place. Now, with a lot of the other journals that we're just starting that journey of requiring data availability statements, it's a bit early, obviously, to include something like an integration of technology, perhaps, into that. So I think there is a real need to start from that policy, from that basic transparency. But then, either of these solutions could be considered. And perhaps if a journal doesn't have that editorial team to support, then technology can come in and bridge that gap, right? And help authors make it easy so that we're implementing these things. Automation is also something in everybody's radar. So eventually we will be incorporating, better tools that support authors online as they are submitting the paper to think about how they need to share to tailor that guidance and that support to the specific manuscript that they have, etc. So that's also exciting in the future.
Yeah, I was going to say it wouldn't be a conference presentation in 2024 without talking about AI or automation in some way. And the perspective I'm quite interested in hearing is how that role of editorial expertise or editorial involvement or engagement potentially works alongside that or has to shift to accommodate that, without necessarily talking about very specific interventions. Is that something that you really see as being the driver of kind of safe forms of automation, or how would you see that would work together? That's for either of you, Patrick or Erica.
I mean, it's clear that we need to investigate and embrace sort of what technology can offer, but we have a lot of experience in doing the job that we've been doing for many years. So I think it has to be really a combination that leverages both of those strengths, right? The knowledge that the editors have about the particular needs of that author or that community and the situation in the data, with a little bit more sort of efficiency and insight that we can gather from tools.
Fantastic. Well, I'm just looking at the time, and I think we have around 10 minutes left. So I think, should we start? We can start to look at some of the questions. And thanks everybody for sending in your questions and answers. We'll try and cover the ones which have already been submitted before giving people a chance to ask any burning questions that you might have live. Kaya, I don't know whether you've been able to sort of prioritize these or filter through any that might have been answered already.
Yes, I can read through and just open it up to any of you on the panel to answer. So one of the first questions that came in was requiring data availability statements are a step forward, but research shows that they are not enough. Where is Springer Nature looking to go from here to improve publication validation? And then a further comment from the same audience member is, as someone from a science-specific NASA repository with growing cloud services, we are looking for ways to partner with publishers to help with this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's one that I actually make quite a lot when I'm speaking to researchers, when I'm talking at these community events, which is that it's really important to understand the role that policy plays in this and the role that data availability statements play. I've never seen them actually as a solution to all the problems around data sharing. They're a very, I would say, quite basic first step, but that really shows, I think, where we are. That being able to embed that transparency is quite a big shift, and it's quite a big shift for a publisher of our size to be able to do that. But we don't expect adding a data availability statement to suddenly lead to all the data being made publicly available. This is where the point of I think iteratively improving what we're doing comes in. So we're really trying to use these behavioral principles, work in an agile kind of way to say, okay, well, we've got data availability statements in there. They tell us about the data sharing patterns already. How can we do things like integrating repositories? How can we build on the skills that editorial support teams have to identify this? How can we build on the automation, for example, which might say, look at this data set and say, is there a specialist repository available, and then recommend that? Those kinds of things are what we're exploring. But without that baseline, without that policy there, we're not able to do that from the first steps. So I would totally agree. I think there is a lot that we can do with this, and we've seen a lot of partnerships. For example, within the earth sciences, we have this enabling fair data principles where we have worked with specific repositories and institutions that are really trying to manage this. So we're looking to really partner with the community in this respect. Obviously, from a technological point of view, there are thousands of data repositories out there, and integrating with all of them is not really going to be an option. So it would be great for us if there was actually a bit more of an interoperable kind of framework just to work with repositories in general. As it is, we're kind of taking it one step at a time and working on multiple fronts for this.
Great. Another question came in about what was the rationale for moving away from the templated data availability statement?
Yeah, I mean, there's a fairly straightforward one for that. So when we launched data policies in 2016, we provided a series of templates, and they said things like the data that were generated and or analyzed in this study are available on request from the corresponding author, something like this. Just to really make it easy, because authors may not be familiar with this and they didn't really know what to add in. The number of papers we're seeing being published with that literal block of text being published in it, so generated and or analyzed, just available from the author on request, it kind of showed the authors weren't necessarily it was undermining the point of the policy, really. They weren't making this specific to their papers, and they weren't really thinking about data sharing in any way. What we're trying to do, without making it prohibitively difficult, was move away from the templated statements towards something which got authors just thinking a bit more about their data when they're actually writing their data availability statement. And you can see on our policy site, we provide these, for example, like clinical sciences, life sciences, examples of what data sharing in a repository looks like, what a DAS for sharing available on request, with all the right contact details there and long-term preservation and things actually involves. And that's where we find it can actually shift people towards sharing in repositories.
Mm-hmm. A question came in about how much of Nature's APC goes towards supporting researchers with their data sharing and validation. I think we've touched on a lot of the services that we provide, the educational resources. We touched on the validation point. It's not something that can be quantified, but I think that throughout this presentation, we have really covered all of the ways in which we support the authors who are publishing in our portfolio, but I don't know if any of you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think you've said it very well, Kaya, that if essentially most of our costs are in the people that work behind these papers, and we have a large amount of staff that runs the journals. Patrick and his team, for example, there's a number of scientists that get hired to filter, amplify, and enhance those papers that we publish. So we also have press teams, production teams, editorial assistants, arts experts. So we're a big team of people that goes behind each paper. It is true also and undeniable that in the filtering process, we spend a lot of time with things as well, with papers, manuscripts, assessing them that may not end up in publications. So the shift to an APC model is always very challenging for selective journals that employ a large amount of staff. But yeah, as you've said, it's a combination of the activities of these editors, of which data policies and ensuring we move the needle in open science is an extremely passionate topic for our editors. It's something we have absolutely no problem getting them behind to make efforts and work with their authors on this. So in that sense, it's a very positive task that they do, if I may say it that way. But it is part of a larger job that the editors and many others do.
Yeah, and I think from the graphs that Graham presented, you can see that we really have moved the needle in terms of, the impact of editorial intervention. So that's a very positive proof point there. Another question is, when data is available, is it raw data or the process data that goes into the figures, which is to say, do the metrics presented on data sharing distinguish between raw data and process data?
Yeah, this is one of those really interesting questions about where editorial expertise come in, because this is one of the key questions that we get asked. It's one of the key choices that someone has to make if they're working data checks, like in an editorial support role, is determining what any of those terms actually mean. We typically talk about the measurement level minimal data set to support the conclusions and analysis provided. So is that raw in terms of hot off the instrument doing the measuring, or is it summarized to less to a lesser extent than just a graph in a paper, for example. All of that has to be applied really at a discipline and a data type level. And again, this is where the interaction between data specialists and curators that we have and the editors really comes into play, because it will mean totally different things in different disciplines. In terms of the metrics that I presented, there isn't a distinction made there. It is measured at, I would say, a relatively coarser level than that any sharing within a repository. Specialist repositories will usually have standards embedded around exactly what data have to be shared.
All right, I think we're almost at time, but is there any one of these questions, Graham, or any of you that you would in particular like to answer? I know you've been engaging a little bit here.
Yeah, I've tried to answer a couple in the chat. One picking out about the uptick in the mixed mode of data sharing that we presented. Interesting one about concerns about authors finding loopholes, because I did briefly mention this to Patrick previously, and we think it might be the other way around, actually. I think it was an increase in scrutiny on the data. Part of this uptick may actually be towards putting more requirements on authors about sharing data in the exact right type of data in the right way. So less that there's just a general approach of not sharing data, and more that maybe some people revert a little bit more towards wanting to have a bit more control once these data requirements are placed on them.
So I know we're at time. Unfortunately, we didn't get to answer every single question here, but hopefully perhaps we can follow up offline. I will copy all of the questions, and then perhaps we can respond directly through the Zoom platform, if that works.
Yep, fantastic. Well, thanks for your support, and thanks everyone for joining. It was a really useful discussion. That I can see there's some of the other questions in there. Possibly we can actually follow up with people separately. I think we will get a copy of this chat. So yeah, that's an excellent discussion, and it was great to see the level of engagement around this. These slides are available, as I said, within the chat, and we'll add them to the OSF section. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of the Open Science Conference, and I hope that this has given you some useful insights into how we can really make a difference at the ground level to this. Thanks to our panelists as well, Erica, Patrick, and Kai, for the support. And yeah, thanks everybody.